We've often heard the question, what is a self? What is the self? Who am I? And we've had this question lots of different ways. I was listening to Krishnamurti addressing such a question recently. It was humorous to watch him. In the garden that I'm observing, a rat is carefully scurrying between some bushes. And the wind is moving the leaves of the trees. And all of the garden is moving. Each aspect uniquely, almost musically. The self isn't anything. In fact, what we might say is nothing to get too concerned about, or even just not really there that way. But that's saying too much too simply. One thing we can notice is that whatever the self might be, there's the rat again, scurrying between protected positions in a living calendar, interrupting me, alive, in the sunlight. I'm outside of a box. Even though I'm in the structure of it, it's framing all around me, and in my mind, I can see the garden. I'm with the garden. And the past and the future. A little fly. I am here. But who am I? What is myself? Well, in every frame that I bring or encounter, real or fictional, imagined, linguistic, analytical, how I will be will change dramatically. If I'm alone, in a box, I may be disoriented, for all the time around me is dead, and the movement is... What is the movement? What is moving in a box? To what rhythms does it move? What music does it obey? Where does it originate? So whatever a self might be, who am I, isn't really a question that's very meaningful without a framework. And if we have a fictional or linguistic framework, the question suddenly is connotated by that framework, so that if I'm drinking a cup of tea and writing a concerto, that will change very suddenly if there is an earthquake. Or if the doorbell rings, or a text comes on a device. If I hear a sound like a child crying, or a bell, myself will change. So, who am I is a process of changing in relation with what we could think of as frameworks, and I think that these frameworks often dominate us and sort of exclude the possibility of a self, and so we're left asking, who am I in a conflict of largely fictional frameworks and boxes and screens and electronic signals, fictional imperatives, fictional collectives, based on language and commerce and structured, quote, society, unquote, what we are and do together, apparently believing there is nothing else or little else we could or should or are capable of doing, sometimes. And so this question, who am I, comes already from a place of something's missing. If it weren't, the question is almost the evidence of its departure or departing problem. In some framework, there's a question, who am I? But what's interesting is the relationship between the question and the one presenting it. Or even the question, who are you? For we then imagine that someone might be able to tell us who they are. Of course we mean, perhaps, give me some pivots around which to imagine who you might be and be becoming, so that I may have some to determine, perhaps almost in thought, who I should be and be becoming in relation with you. So now we find out that not only are the selves not discrete things existing, but actually they discover what to be and become together, according to many complex variables. Water. So that, were there really selves there before they met? Of a kind, maybe. We might call it habits of persisting across gaps. Right? We had habits of maintaining a self-like quality outside of actual relationships and nature, each other, and true developmental activity. We sort of built little boats that we could climb in and go across these gaps. The gaps in all the different aspects of our lives, our work, our sleep, our food, our relationships with others, the depth or truth of them, the conflicts, the joys, the victories, the losses, the births and the deaths, etc. The days, the hours, the minutes, all the gaps. So that a self, quote-unquote, is essentially a kind of slapped-together vehicle to survive and cross between gaps in all kinds of frameworks that aren't real, mostly, or are conflicted with the real, 5 ways to Sunday, and in which we participate or feel we must or are compelled to. We, whoever that we is. So there's something confusing going on there. But there's some tropes that can kind of help us out. So the first thing is that I think our language confuses us about what it means to be separate. We seem to think that the separateness is the true part, and then we add the connection, maybe. And in everything in nature and reality, physics, and everywhere, something else is true, which is that unity descends into orders of apparent distinction that are new forms of unity in distinction. And some of these are so elaborate that you get living planets down there somewhere in the process, and within those you get minds with questions. So there's something quite amazing going on, and if we wanted to make a bucket-like model of it, we could, somewhere in the dimension that we'll call origin, put a conical upside-down bucket and in rings around that bucket we'll put holes, maybe in a spiral. And some kind of water pours into that bucket, and down here you get universes, which pour into galaxies, which pour into star systems and black holes and other fascinating phenomenon. And then you get our star, and its whole history, the whole history of the formation of this part of the galaxy, our star itself, its whole birth process, the formation of the solar system, the origins of the Earth and the Moon and the planets. And there was quite a very big adventure there, we can be sure, one that is not yet over, that we are participating in and as. And then you get the Earth, and then you get life on Earth, and then you get all of the different species, and the evolutionary epochs, and the cataclysms, and the moments of vast opportunity when life leapt forward and became vastly diverse and astonishing. And then you get our people showing up, and then you get the entire history of mankind within that bubble of life and the universe and time-space origin. And then you get me, our people, this time, you and I, our minds, our bodies, our own hands. So if my hand was to wonder, who am I, that would be like me wondering, who am I? I am a hand of all of those. My body even looks like a hand. Our bodies are very hand-like. It looks like we might be the hands of something if you just looked at us walking around. We don't normally see this, but artists do. Anyone who understands the anatomy of the hand and then compares it with that of the body will immediately see astonishing, shall we say, perspectives on how the unique ways that wholes don't have parts. And so since we aren't really parts, we don't really have a self. In fact, we don't have things. My hand is holding something right now, but it doesn't have it. In fact, fascinatingly, my hand doesn't have anything. And a self is like that. The problem with a self is it's invisible, so it's a kind of a hand that once it grasps something, it thinks, oh, I'm that. I can grasp it. Now I've got that. Got that packed away. I know what I am. I know what to be. Well, when a hand is grasping a tool, it knows what to do. Or we know what to do. We know we're directing our hands, right? So we know what to do with it. Hopefully. Many tools are very compelling. They can tell hands what to become. They can tell hands and people what to become. A paintbrush is such a tool. A paintbrush creates new minds, new bodies, new ways of being selves. So too does a knife. A sewing needle, with which we create clothing or tapestries, with which we might bind together a wound, is a very special way of being a hand and becoming ourselves. So when the hand is holding something and we are driving it, right? We are there, we are alive, we are human, hopefully intelligent. We become kind of what we're doing with our hands, as even I am to some degree now. But I don't possess any of those things. There's no self to possess having done them. The hand doesn't own anything. And even if I wear a ring, right, which is kind of a self for the hand, isn't it? Something that's conserved over every interval of action. Yeah? If I wear a ring on my hand, this doesn't tell my hand what it is. But interestingly, our marriage rings say that our hands are for one another. Our hands are bonded. This is not just one hand you see here. This is the hand of a union. It's here with and for, as and from. in hope and joy and wonder and protection of this union. And this, now we are getting close without having to wear any rings. For self is the recognition of the unities of origin, nature, descent, not in language or mathematics or physics, though in an intellectual way there, and in logic. No, in being. The living recognition before all fictions of our nature. This is only itself in relation. And in relations that are disoriented or oriented around boxes and fictions, frameworks and language, declarations, religion, formal declarations of identity and value, the self has to be counterfeited, has to make up rings. The hand of our being must make up rings and conserve and protect and defend and make new ones and so on. So if you want to ask what is the self, really you're saying it's the one who keeps making those rings to get across gaps that are uninhabitable in a sense, and they're empty of beings. They're words and fictions and ideas and structures and so on, algorithms and things. But there's something kind of funny, which is when I was a kid, the early Warner Brothers cartoons were very popular, meaning in the circle, all of the elements found them exciting and funny. There were intelligent objections. The most intelligent I've ever heard was from Fred Rogers before, I believe, a Senate subcommittee, and I encourage anyone listening to watch Fred Rogers' speech to I think the Senate. It's brilliant and human. And there is an excellent example of someone becoming brilliant and human on the spot, in the moment, in a courtroom even. But we used to watch the Warner Brothers cartoons a lot, and some of you will be familiar with Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, or Bugs Bunny, and some of his cohort, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, Elmer Fudd, the usual suspects. And of all of them, Roadrunner is kind of the best and most pure in one sense, the sense I want to point at, that Wile E. Coyote is the explicit not catching of Roadrunner. He doesn't get it. Wile E. Coyote is a joke the Roadrunner is playing on itself. And so the idea that the coyote is going to capture and eat its own origin is incredibly, hilariously ridiculous when you watch this try to play out. And it's much like the mind with which we form the question, who am I? It's the Wile E. Coyote mind. It thinks it's going to somehow capture and maybe manipulate, hold on to its own origin. So if you think you could do that, you can just roll up your right sleeve, if you've got a sleeve, and hold up your empty right hand and attempt to grab your right wrist with your right hand. Go for it. See how that works out. As long as you do that, you'd probably be kind of funny, because it just, no matter what you do, it's not going to work, and you might be able to develop a prosthesis that would allow that. But even should you accomplish that, the result will be ridiculous and hilarious, and maybe some kind of abstract art object. So Wile E. Coyote builds all kinds of machines and plans and plots to try to capture the Roadrunner, who's essentially dreaming him. And as you can imagine, because you've probably tried to capture a dream, maybe so that you could bring it to life in the world somehow, or show someone else what it is, it doesn't work. Dreams don't have the structure of things we can transmit. They don't have this nature. Huh? And the self is much like this. And Bugs Bunny is a similar jest. It's almost as if Porky Pig and Daffy Duck are in many cases creatures he's dreaming. And so he kind of knows he's lucidly dreaming them. And this is true of the Roadrunner as well. The Roadrunner is kind of lucidly dreaming the coyote that's chasing him. This is far more profound than it appears. If you haven't seen Roadrunner and Coyote cartoons, Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, I encourage you to watch one or two just to get the flavor of it so that you'll understand how it is to think I have a self and want to know what that is. Truly, the self originates in an activity that we don't really have a name for. It isn't dreaming, but this is probably the closest thing in our language to, quote, where we're coming from, unquote. So it's a flowing process, and how we will articulate that flow will modulate radically depending on what we think we're supposed to do, as if there were a book of supposed to written somewhere by a couple of Italian guys or something. And, you know, what others how we think of what others think we may be thinking or doing, and such and on in this. A kind of internal fictional amphitheater, because actual others are missing. So we, like children who have no friends, right? We invent a kind of a fictional amphitheater. We don't actually belong to any true collective. So we either have to invent a fictional one inside ourselves, kind of ongoingly, as thought and thinking even in part, or we do something more wonderful than that, and we have, I don't know what to call it, we have a unity within, where each of the elements is with and for the other elements. And perhaps nature and learning, intelligence, wonder, origins, discovery. So we wouldn't really want to become the Roadrunner while we're awake. That would just be dreaming. No, the goal is, I guess, not a goal, and has a lot to do with inhabiting a position of union with the history and the origins of our world, minds themselves, nature, living ecologies, the history of humanity, in its actual, real aspect, us, and every living thing that we relate and see, ignore, classify, dissect, analyze, sell, instead. So a position in relation, true relation, in constant recognition of origin coming into being, which essentially looks like children, all of them, every living place and thing, together, one union with endless, astonishing members, each of whom reflect each other, each of whom is with and for each other, in a continuum, flowing into us now. That recognition is so vitalizing and so overwhelming and so beautiful and creative and prodigious and intelligent that nothing else can become it. It is unbecoming to do anything else. And of course, in relation with the structures and the boxes and the cities and the culture and the dead calendars and such, the watches, TikTok. It can be difficult to preserve a sense of orientation. And yet, ironically, it's much more difficult not to. And all the things that happen when we don't, to ourselves and our minds and others, with whom we are here, for whom we are here, are far worse than if we could do the small amount of work and struggle to sort of pierce the membrane a little bit to bring something true through from within, from union, from unity, beyond all the fictions, just as the hand of the history of human hope and wonder, adoration, and possibility. And that's a self we can't define. And every definition impoverishes it. Yet we can learn to remember and see, play and become many different ways from anything we've seen. Things that don't become religions, but arts of our humanity. In relationship in and as nature. A hand is not what it holds, but a self can become very confused and think it is that upon which it has some grasp. Well, if you travel up the wrist, hopefully, where the grasp of that hand is originating, there is a living, flowing, endlessly ancient, astonishingly eternal, and unimaginably intelligent. What is there? It is not a fire. It is an incarnation of all of the orders and histories and lineages of origin. It is not one incarnation, right? But like we might even imagine the flower, a carnation, with all its many petals flowing into being. It is incarnating. It is an incarnating incarnation. But in the soul and consciousness, the self is kind of a ghost. And one of the things that's most useful to have some direct awareness of is that in some way the waking self is a joke. It's a bit of a jest that the soul of our being is having on with us while awake. And it's quite astonishing when one has the actual experience of recognizing this. Yet this is the implication of the cartoons. That actually the waking self is a very sophisticated learning playground for the dreaming soul. This is a beautiful and hilarious thing to recognize, and is the source of many of the things that we find humor in, because the dreaming self has a very different take on identity and relation, and it's always with us while we're awake, so that when we suddenly see from a radically new angle, there's the experience of humor. This is almost the dreaming self recognizing, or the waking self recognizing that it had been dreaming in a way all along, and suddenly someone has come and highlighted a path or a route, right, that links the features by which it can see, of course I always knew that, or I've laughed about that inside but never said anything. Or I've seen something similar myself, quote unquote, myself. Yet we see truly with and for each other. And when we can remember to see with and for the history and future of life on earth first and our humanity within that gentle union, then we will begin to see. We will learn what it means to have eyes. For until then we will see with what we're grasping, what we're holding on to. And as you can imagine, the hand-like eyes of the mind are easily confused by that which can be grasped in concept, language, form, number, or thought. They begin to see that reality is what can be grasped. And yet this is the opposite of any meaningful way of being ourselves. The arts of the intellect are all valuable and pure in and of themselves. None of them are implicitly lethal. And yet when they escape their confines and begin to declare reality or identity, value or relationship to us, then they have become lethal. And then the grasp is not a living grasp at all, but a kind of a death grip. So we can release the idea of a self. We can let go and, just like our hands, have no possessions. All the things our hands can do, they have no way to possess them. They have no place to possess them. Yeah? And the self is much like this. Yet while awake, it is hand-like, as if the fingertips are eyes. It forgets it has a wrist and starts chasing something like completeness. Yet its origin is in a living, intelligent incompletingness, as much as it is in anything that can or may be preserved across gaps